After 45 years of loyalty, my children treated me like trash. The moment my wife passed away, they shoved a worn envelope into my face and roared, "You were just unpaid help, get out and never come back." I was betrayed, kicked out of my own home in bitterness. Inside that envelope was no money, only an old rusted key. They laughed at an old man's helplessness, but they were wrong. I walked away quietly, not to run, but to start a plan they will never forget. Hello and welcome to the story. Before we discover why a rusted key was left to me after 45 years, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Also note, this is a fictional story created for storytelling, offering meaningful and enriching ideas. The air in Alaric Prescott's office tasted like expensive mahogany and cold, calculated finality. I sat in a high-backed leather chair that felt more like a witness stand than an inheritance hearing. Brooke Sterling, a 73-year-old retired bridge inspector, whose hands still bore the calluses of a lifetime of structural integrity, that is who I am. Though in this room, I felt as flimsy as a blueprint in a storm. My wife Elena had been gone for 2 weeks, and the heavy silence of the office seemed to be measuring my worth. Alaric Prescott, a maritime lawyer with a voice like grinding stones, held the heavy cream envelope that would change my world. He looked at me with a professional pity that made my stomach churn with stale coffee. Standing by the window was Griffin Sterling, 58. A man with the posture of one who already owned the skyline, his venture capital eyes already liquidating my 45 years of service into a line item. Beside him, Leona Sterling, 56, and sharp-edged in her designer suit, tapped a manicured nail against the mahogany table, her eyes as cold as the luxury suites she managed. Maddox Sterling, at 54, couldn't keep his leg from bouncing, the nervous energy of a hedge fund manager in a losing trade, making him look as unstable as the markets he bet on. Finally, there was Sloane Sterling, the youngest, at 52, checking her reflection in her phone screen with practiced indifference, her mind clearly on her next resort project, rather than the man she was about to make homeless. Alaric cleared his throat, the sound rhythmic like the ceiling fans click above us. He began reading the primary distribution of Elena's $18 million estate. My heart hammered against my ribs as he listed the properties, the shares, and the liquid assets, all being carved up and handed to the 4 people who had treated me like a ghost for decades. Then came the twist that felt like a bridge collapse. Alaric read the section regarding my status. Elena's will officially classified our 45-year marriage as domestic service. Have you ever felt the ground turn into liquid beneath your feet? While a room full of people watched you drown, I was described as domestic staff who had been adequately compensated during my tenure. The law was being used as a scalpel to excise me from her history. Griffin let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed against the wood panels, his unnervingly white veneers flashing in the light. He looked at me and said that 45 years was a long time to be a butler for free. Alaric didn't look up as he slid a worn brown envelope across the slick mahogany table. He told me it was my only inheritance. Adequate compensation. 2 words. 45 years. Gone. The insult was a physical weight. Griffin told me to get on with it, because they had a flight to Vegas to catch. Sloane stood up and intentionally left a business card for a low-end senior shelter on the table, sliding it toward me with a smirk. Griffin leaned down, whispering that he had been the one to pressure the grandparents to change the trust structures decades ago, to ensure I never saw a cent. They stood as one, a unified wall of greed, and filed out of the office to celebrate their victory. As Griffin slammed the door, I felt the envelope in my hand. It was heavier than paper, containing something that rattled with the ghost of a metal chime. I gripped the steering wheel of my 20-year-old truck until my knuckles turned as white as the Seattle fog, the brown envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. The heavy clinical silence of the lawyer's office still rang in my ears, punctuated by the sharp, jagged laughter of my stepchildren. I drove through the winding streets of Madison Park, with a numbness that felt like a secondary skin eventually pulling into the driveway of the mansion I had called home for nearly half a century. The structure loomed over me, a monument of stone and glass that now felt entirely alien. I let myself in through the heavy front door, my footsteps echoing across the marble foyer with a hollow, lonely sound. I retreated to my small library, a sanctuary of dust and floor wax, where the shadows felt more welcoming than the brightly lit rooms Griffin and his siblings were already mentally refurnishing. With hands that refused to remain steady, I tore open the worn brown envelope. I had expected a meager check, a final insult of a few $1,000s, to carry me into a destitute retirement, but instead a heavy tarnished brass key fell out. It hit the mahogany desk with a dull thud tied to a small weathered tag by a fraying piece of twine. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized this wasn't money or a legal dismissal. It was a tangible physical piece of metal, cold and heavy in my palm. My life had been a bridge I inspected daily, only to realize the pylons were made of secrets and the asphalt was a veneer of lies. I found a single sheet of Elena's personal stationery tucked inside the folds of the envelope. Her handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, precise, and haunting. "Go to Orcas Island," the note said. "Trust me one last time." I stared at the words until they blurred. Orcas Island was a place Elena mentioned only in passing, a destination for those mysterious wellness retreats she took every third weekend for the last 40 years. I had never questioned her, never suspected that she was building a second world far away from the complexities of the sterling name. If you've ever looked at a photograph of the person you loved and realized you were looking at a stranger, then you know the cold that began to settle in my bones. I realized those retreats weren't retreats at all, but secret journeys to a place she had kept hidden even from me, the man who had supposedly stood by her side through everything. The fading light of the Seattle sunset filtered through the library window, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Outside, the sound of a luxury car's engine idling in the driveway cut through the silence. My children were returning, their voices already loud with the entitlement of the newly rich as they argued over the silver and the art. I looked down at the tag attached to the brass key, turning it over in the dim light. I found a second, smaller note tucked inside the tag's plastic sleeve, written in a tiny, hurried scrawl I hadn't seen at first. "The key isn't for a house, Brooks. It's for the truth." The weight of the metal felt like an anchor in my trembling palm, pulling me away from the wreckage of this house toward a horizon I could barely imagine. I looked at the brass key, then at the single suitcase in my closet. For the first time in 45 years, I wasn't waiting for permission to leave. The doorbell didn't ring. The locks just turned, and the Madison Park mansion was no longer a home, but a crime scene of greed. I heard the heavy front doors swing open, followed by the sharp, authoritative click of heels on marble that could only belong to Leona. I moved to the upper wing, the brass key heavy and cold in my pocket, and began to pack with a frantic, silent efficiency. I didn't reach for the heirlooms or the expensive art. I reached for my worn bridge inspection tools, the steel gauges and calipers that had been my true companions for decades. My knuckles were still white from the drive back, my mind a whirlpool of Elena's cryptic stationery and the rattling envelope. I was halfway through folding a flannel shirt when Griffin and Leona burst into the room, accompanied by a woman in a sharp charcoal suit who carried a digital measuring tape. They didn't look at me. They spoke about me in the third person, as if I were a piece of outdated machinery being inventoried before decommissioning. Leona pointed toward my mahogany dresser, noting that the help's furniture needed to be hauled to the dump immediately. Griffin leaned against the doorframe, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain. He muttered about gutting the entire wing, claiming the smell of old man and cheap tobacco was baked so deep into the drywall that only a total renovation could save the property value. I ignored the taste of bitterness and cold coffee in my throat, focusing entirely on the weight of the suitcase. "Are you still here?" Brooks Griffin asked, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "I thought the moving van Alaric mentioned was for your ego, but it seems you're intent on lingering like a bad smell." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I snapped the latches on my suitcase and turned to leave, but as I reached for the light switch, I heard a digital chime from the hallway. Click. The sound of a deadbolt is the most honest thing a sterling child has ever said to me. I realized then that Griffin had already changed the codes to the security system while I was busy packing my life into a single bag, essentially locking me out of my own history before I had even cleared the threshold. I spent the next few hours in a small, windowless guest room waiting for the dead of night. At 4 a.m., I carried my suitcase down the grand staircase, stepping carefully to avoid the creaks I had known for 45 years. I reached the foyer and found Griffin sitting in the dark living room, nursing a glass of high-end scotch and holding Elena's favorite crystal vase up to the moonlight. Leaving so soon, he asked, his voice low and jagged, "You didn't even say goodbye to the silverware." I stopped at the door, the cold bite of the morning air already seeping through the cracks. "Keep the silver griffin," I told him without turning around. "You're going to need it to pay for the soul you've lost." I walked out to my old truck. The rumble of the diesel engine, a defiant roar in the suburban silence. The mansion loomed in the rearview mirror like a mausoleum for a marriage that died the moment Elena's heart stopped. As I cleared the heavy wrought iron gates for the final time, I saw a sedan parked under a dead street lamp. I watched the headlights in the mirror, a pair of cold eyes trailing me toward the coast, and I realized the children weren't content with taking the past. They wanted to kill my future, too. I pushed the pedal to the floor, the old engine screaming as I navigated the winding roads toward Anacortes. The salt, heavy air of the sound began to seep through the vents, but it did little to cool the fire of paranoia burning in my chest. Behind me, the headlights I had seen at the Madison Park gates remained a constant, mocking presence. Griffin's reach felt long, a shadow cast across the highway. I slammed the gear stick into park as the ferry's steel ramp hit the concrete with a bone-jarring thud echoing the finality of the life I'd left on the mainland. The rhythmic vibrating of the ferry's engine hummed through the soles of my boots, a low-frequency reminder that I was still moving, still breathing. I scanned the loading zone, my eyes catching the glint of a black SUV that had been glued to my bumper for the last 50 miles. "Not today, you vulture," I muttered under my breath. As the deckhands signaled for the Orcas Island lane, I pulled into the holding area for Lopez Island instead, watching the SUV follow suit. At the absolute last second, before the barrier dropped, I swerved my truck back into the Orcas line, leaving the black vehicle trapped behind a wall of tourist RVs and frustrated vacationers. A surge of adrenaline-fueled relief washed over me as the ferry pulled away from the dock, leaving my shadow stranded on the mainland. I watched the shoreline recede, the distance between me and the Sterling children, growing with every churning knot of the Salish Sea. How many years of your life have to pass before you realize the person sleeping next to you was actually a chess master, and you were the most protected piece on the board? The question haunted me throughout the 90-minute crossing. When the ferry finally docked at Orcas Island, the world felt different. The air was thick with the smell of damp cedar and rotting pine needles, a sharp departure from the sterile scent of Seattle luxury. I drove off the ramp and immediately spotted her. Saskia Thorne, 70, stood at the terminal on Orcas Island, with a sign that bore my name and a look of profound relief, her silver hair braided tight like a nautical rope. She didn't wait for me to speak. "You're late, Brooks," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "Elena said you'd be prompt." I stared at her, the brass key heavy in my pocket. "She told you I was coming 40 years ago?" I asked. Saskia gave me a knowing look as she led me to a rugged, mud-caked Jeep. "She told me you'd come when the wolves finally bared their teeth," she replied. I climbed in, and we drove deep into the island's ancient, moss-covered interior. Moss. It was everywhere, suffocating the trees, hiding the stones, and whispering secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Saskia handled the Jeep with a practiced aggression, turning onto a restricted forest road that seemed to swallow the morning light. As we bounced over the uneven terrain, She dropped a bomb that shattered my fragile sense of triumph. That SUV you evaded at the dock wasn't working for Griffin, she said casually. It was a protective detail Elena had hired to keep you safe from the moment she took her last breath. I realized then that in my fear I had successfully outrun the only shield I had left. The Jeep screeched to a halt before a set of iron gates so rusted they looked like they were bleeding into the emerald forest floor. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking as I stared at the crest, forged into the iron. I reached out and touched the iron scrollwork, half expecting the gates to burn my skin for trespassing on a secret Elena had died to keep. The metal was freezing, weeping rust onto my calloused fingertips. Saskia didn't hesitate. She took the brass key I had been clutching like a talisman and slid it into the lock. Despite the neglected appearance of the exterior, the heavy click of the iron gate hinges was effortless. They were well-oiled, maintained with a precision that mocked the decay of the metal. We drove up a winding quarter-mile driveway, the tires of the Jeep crunching over gravel, while old-growth Douglas firs arched overhead, stitching together a canopy that effectively blocked out the sky. When we finally emerged into a clearing, the sight nearly stole the breath from my lungs. It was a 19th-century fieldstone homestead, a rugged and beautiful fortress perched on a jagged cliff edge. Below us, the gray expanse of the Pacific churned, sending a fine mist of salt spray into the air. This was no falling-down cottage, as Griffin and Leona had sneered in Seattle. This was a legacy. It's not a ruin, Saskia, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. It's a fortress. She looked at me with a softness I hadn't expected. She called it a sanctuary, Brooks, a place where the world couldn't reach you. Walking into that house was like stepping inside the chambers of a heart that had been beating for me in total silence for half a century. The interior didn't smell like a museum or a tomb. It smelled of lavender-scented furniture wax and the sharp, clean tang of sea salt. I walked into the open-plan living area and stopped dead. My heart, already fragile, seemed to skip a beat. The walls weren't decorated with the abstract art Elena favored in Seattle. Instead, they were covered in hundreds of framed, candid photographs. They were all of me. I saw myself in the 80s helmet on inspecting the underside of a suspension bridge. There was a shot of me sleeping in my favorite chair, a book splayed on my chest. I touched the cold glass of a frame from 1988, showing me laughing at a joke I'd long since forgotten. As I stood there, Saskia handed me a leather-bound folder. My eyes blurred as I read the deed. The property had been in my name since 1978. I had been the legal owner of a multi-million-dollar estate for 35 years without ever knowing it. How do you reconcile the woman who called you a servant in her will with the woman who built a stone cathedral to your existence? I felt seen in a way that was almost violent. Saskia stood by the window watching the waves. Every time she left Seattle, she came here to curate this, she said quietly. You were her only masterpiece. I moved toward the fireplace where a large photo sat at the center of the mantel. It wasn't just of me. It was a candid shot of me and Elena together in 1986, the very year she allegedly began her descent into cruelty. We were smiling, leaning into each other with an intimacy that felt like a punch to my ribs. My eyes locked onto a photo I had never seen, a picture of me from only 3 months ago, taken through a window I thought was closed. Someone had been watching me even when I was alone. The realization that I had been Elena's shadow for 45 years, while she was my architect, made the very air in the living room feel heavy with the ghost of her presence. I stood before that recent photograph, the one taken through the study window only months ago, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the island mist. Saskia reached into her pocket and pulled out a second key, this one polished to a mirror shine and surprisingly cool to the touch. This is the last piece, Brooks, she said, her voice dropping to a solemn whisper. The rest is between you and the letters. I took the silver key, feeling its cold, metallic weight. Did she ever talk about me when she was here? I asked, my voice barely audible. Saskia didn't blink. Every single day. Usually while she was writing, I turned away from the museum of my own life and moved toward the staircase. Each wooden step offered a familiar grounding creak as I ascended toward the upper floor, leaving the museum of my physical life for the nerve center of Elena's hidden mind. I stood before the heavy oak door of the study, the silver key poised at the lock. I could sense that turning this mechanism would finalize the death of the man I thought I was, and perhaps birth a stranger in his place. My eyes drifted to the dates. The records in this room didn't span our whole marriage. They began in July 1986. That was the exact month I was promoted to senior bridge inspector. It was a career milestone I'd always celebrated, never suspecting it might have been the trigger for a decades-long defensive maneuver. Silence. Not the empty kind, but the heavy, vibrating silence of a library where every book is about you. I pushed the door open. 3 walls were lined with identical, meticulously labeled binders and sealed envelopes, a monolithic archive of a life lived in parallel to mine. They were organized with the clinical precision of a biotech executive, stretching from that fateful summer in 1986 all the way to March 2021. Exactly 420 letters. One for every single month she had spent being cold, distant, and seemingly indifferent to my existence. If a woman spends 35 years writing to a husband who thinks she hates him, is she a saint or a strategist? On the center of the mahogany desk sat a single thick, cream-colored envelope. Elena's precise, practiced cursive was scrawled across the front, "Read this first." The smell of old paper and a faint trace of ozone from a nearby security server filled my lungs. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the tactile resistance of the heavy paper feeling like a physical barrier between my world and hers. I broke the wax seal, the brittle red shell snapping under my thumb. As the heavy paper yielded a scent I hadn't smelled in decades, Elena's original wedding perfume, a faint floral ghost wafted from the pages like a long-buried prayer. Tucked inside the paper was more than just a confession. My fingers brushed against the hard plastic of a micro SD card and a folded parchment that revealed a detailed map of the estate's hidden security sensors. She hadn't just left me a diary, she had left me a command center. I unfolded the stationery, the sharp rustle echoing in the still room. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic thud that matched the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The first line of the letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It offered an apology for my survival. The first line of the letter didn't ask for my forgiveness. It offered a cold, clinical apology for the fact that I was still breathing. I sat in the silent study, the heavy scent of vintage perfume from the broken wax seal mixing with the smell of old paper and ozone. My hands were still trembling as I turned the first page of Elena's confession. She wrote with a brutal honesty that made the world tilt on its axis, claiming that for 35 years she had lived as a complete stranger in her own skin. She described June 14, 1986, as the day the woman I loved died, so that a protector could be born. I felt the breath leave my lungs as the math of our misery began to take shape. It wasn't a tragedy of lost love, but a calculated defense budget for my very life. Elena revealed that the plot to dispose of me hadn't been a sudden whim of the children's greed, but a scheme actively engineered and encouraged by her own parents. They saw me as a low-class bridge inspector who had no place in their biotech empire, and they were the ones who whispered the poisoned words into Griffin's ears. By the time I reached the 3rd page, the taste of copper was thick in the back of my throat, a physical manifestation of the stress of learning my life had been a marked target. Have you ever found out that the person you thought was your executioner was actually the only one holding the blade away from your throat? The letter transported me back to a rainy night in 1986 at our Madison Park home. Elena described standing in the hallway, the smell of rain and wet wool clinging to her coat after a late meeting. She had been standing outside Griffin's bedroom, intending to offer a simple good night, when she heard the muffled, cruel laughter from behind the closed door. Her children and her own parents were discussing me like a piece of livestock. They were plotting to gaslight me into a dementia diagnosis and ship me off to Shady Pines. Shady Pines, not a retirement home, a cage. My cage. They spoke of the facility as a low-tier warehouse, where I would rot in a sterile room while they bypassed our prenup and liquidated Elena's $15 million in shares. Griffin's voice, younger, but already possessing that predatory edge, argued that I would be happy as long as I had a window and 3 meals. Elena described the cold vibration of the hallway railing as she gripped it, her knuckles white with a rage she couldn't yet show. The twist was even darker than a chance eavesdropping. She revealed that she hadn't just overheard them. She had secretly been recording the room with a hidden device meant to catch a separate business leak, only to find the leak was her own family's humanity. She stood there frozen in that dark hallway, listening to her own parents encourage her children to commit a social murder against the man she loved. I could almost hear that laughter myself echoing through the decades into this quiet island study. Elena's handwriting became jagged as she described that pivotal moment, the ink smudging where her own tears had hit the page 35 years ago. She realized that to save my life, she would have to kill our marriage. She had to become a monster to keep the real monsters at bay, starting a performance of cruelty that would last until her final breath. The letter shifted from the past to the plan detailing the birth of the woman I spent 35 years fearing. To save the man I loved, the paper read in Elena's unwavering cursive, I had to make sure the world believed I didn't love him at all. I sat in the absolute silence of the study, the scratchy texture of the heavy stationery beneath my fingers. Elena explained that the servant language in the will wasn't the final insult I'd felt in Alaric's office. It was a surgical legal maneuver. By classifying me as domestic staff, she had ensured the children could never claim I had used undue influence as a spouse to manipulate her estate. It was a shield, not a slight. She detailed how she began the systematic dismantling of our public partnership starting in July 1986. She stopped including me in corporate galas, instructed the household staff to treat me as a guest rather than a master, and began the performance of the cold matriarch. She wrote that if the children thought I was her partner, they would destroy me to get to her. I made you a ghost so they would stop trying to make you a corpse, she confessed. I stared at the row of identical binders on the wall, the fading light reflecting off their spines. Every time she had missed a birthday or forced me to eat in the kitchen, I had felt a piece of my soul wither. But the letter claimed that every harsh word spoken in front of Griffin or Leona was a calculated lie. Every cold glance was a prayer for my safety. She would come here to Orcas Island later that same month during those wellness retreats I never questioned, to write me a letter of apology I was never meant to see until I was safe. Could you live with a person for 40 years, feeling their coldness every day, if you knew that coldness was the only thing keeping the sun from burning you alive? Apology. After apology. After apology. Organized by year. A ledger of a broken heart. I realized then that while I was mourning the death of our marriage, she was in this very room mourning the woman she had to become. She wrote that she hated that cold version of herself more than I ever could. She had been my architect while I was merely her shadow. The smell of the old mahogany desk seemed to ground me as I turned another page. Elena revealed a final layer to this foundation of secrets. She had secretly deeded this Orcas property to me back in 1978 as a wedding gift. It predated the children's inheritance claims and the family trust's bylaws by years, making the sanctuary legally untouchable and entirely mine. The property wasn't part of her estate. It was an island I had owned in total ignorance while I lived as a ghost in Madison Park. I heard the paper rustle in the silence, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. The binders on the walls weren't just records. They were the bricks of a fortress she had spent her life building for me. Every year, every month, every day of her supposed hatred was a payment into a trust of protection. I looked at the spines of the binders, realizing that for 35 years, While I thought I was losing my wife, she was actually building me a kingdom. She had traded her own peace to ensure that one day I would have mine. I turned to the next section of the letter, where the ink shifted from a wife's sorrow to a CEO's cold mathematical precision. The lines were tight and efficient, outlining a financial architecture I had never suspected existed beneath our feet. Elena revealed the existence of an invisible fortress, a $1.2 million trust fund managed by a discreet third-party firm right here on Orcas Island. This wasn't some sudden deathbed gift. She had been diverting her personal bonuses into this account since 1978, long before the children had reached their majority. The fund was designed to automatically cover every property tax, every utility bill, and provide a monthly stipend for the next 50 years. They think they took everything, but they only took the bait, she wrote. I realized then that while Griffin and the others were fighting over the $18 million estate, they were actually inheriting a poison pill. The bulk of their inheritance was comprised of over-leveraged real estate and corporate trusts tied to high-interest debt that Elena had intentionally left unpaid. They had the Sterling name, but I was the only Sterling who was actually free. Do you remember the moment you stopped being a father and started being a threat? I do. It was the day Elena inherited her first $10 million. The cold, digital glow of the bank statement she had included in the envelope confirmed my new reality, but it felt hollow compared to the memories the letter triggered next. Elena's prose softened, taking me back to the late 70s, the honeymoon years. I could almost smell the oil and grease of a Seattle afternoon in 1976. I was a 28-year-old bridge inspector then, and Elena was a rising star in her parents' firm. I closed my eyes and heard the phantom sound of a small child's laughter echoing in this silent room. I remembered teaching a young Griffin how to fix a bicycle chain in the driveway. "Hold the wrench steady, Griffin," I had told him. "Integrity starts with the small things." I remembered reading bedtime stories to a 7-year-old Sloane, who used to call me Dad without a second thought. We were a real family once Brooks Elena's letter mourned. I had to bury those memories to keep the predators from smelling my weakness. Memory is a bridge with a rusted floor. You have to be careful which planks you step on, or you'll fall straight back into the pain. I felt the salt of a stray tear hit my lip as I read her apology for the years of silence. She had built this island life as a monument to what we used to be, a place where the poison of her parents' greed couldn't reach. The most startling revelation came at the very end of the page. That private investigator I thought Griffin had hired to follow me, he wasn't Griffin's man. Elena had established a protective detail through her island trust years ago. Their only job was to ensure I made it to the ferry safely once she was gone. I had spent the entire drive in a fever of paranoia, outrunning the very shield she had died to provide for me. I stood up my legs, feeling like lead, and looked at the 3 walls of binders. I reached for the first one labeled July 1986, my fingers brushing the rough texture of the spine, as if I were touching the skin of a secret that had been waiting 35 years to scream. The first binder felt heavier than the 20-page letter, its pages yellowed by the damp island air. I skipped past the early years of verbal barbs and petty thefts, my hands instinctively reaching for the binder labeled 2010, the year the accidents started to feel like executions. I pulled the volume for March from the shelf, my skin crawling, as I located the folder for the 12th. The memory of that morning hit me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered waking up early in the Madison Park mansion, my mind focused on a complex bridge blueprint I needed to finalize. I stepped onto the grand oak staircase, and in an instant, my world upended. My foot lost all traction on the 3rd step, and a sickening slide sent me into a 12-stair tumble. The dull thud of my body hitting the oak echoed in the hollow foyer, leaving me with a shattered wrist and 3 broken ribs that made every breath a jagged blade of pain. At the time, Elena had merely appeared at the top of the landing, looking down at me with a cold, detached efficiency as the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance. "You are getting old, Brooks." She had said, her voice a flat line of indifference. Clumsiness is a luxury we cannot afford in this house. I remember whispering back that I didn't trip, that I had slid, but she had already turned away. The discovery in the sanctuary study, however, suggested a far darker architecture. I found an SD card taped to the inside of the March folder and inserted it into the laptop with a cold, clinical click of the keys. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, blue-tinted night vision recording of our staircase. My blood froze as I watched Maddox Sterling dressed in black and wearing black leather gloves, meticulously applying a coat of industrial-grade lubricant to the third, fourth, and fifth steps. Oil, not olive oil. Industrial-grade, colorless, odorless death. The footage was damning. Maddox looked directly toward the hidden camera lens with a smirk that felt like a needle in my heart. He didn't just wait for me to die. He built the trap. I realized then that the lubricant hadn't been a random find. The records in the folder showed it was purchased using a corporate account Maddox shared with Griffin. They were in it together, a collaborative effort to ensure I didn't survive the spring. Is it possible to love a person so much that you let them break their bones just to keep them from losing their life? As I continued to watch, the video revealed the most painful twist of all. Elena entered the frame 5 minutes after Maddox vanished into the shadows. She didn't clean the stairs. Instead, she knelt by the foyer table and carefully positioned a heavy ceramic vase. I realized with a jolt of horror that she was steering the trajectory of my inevitable fall, angling me away from the sharp marble edge of the table that would have surely crushed my skull. She chose a lesser injury, shattered bones and broken ribs, to prevent the fatal one her own son had planned. I paused the video on her face as she stared at the lubricated steps, her expression a mask of agony that I had mistaken for indifference for 8 long years. I felt physically ill, the sharp, metallic smell of the lubricant, seemingly rising from the digital memory to choke me in the present. My children wanted me dead, and my wife had stood by to watch me break, believing it was the only way to keep me alive. The next folder was thicker, its label written in a red ink that felt like a warning. I pulled a grainy, high-contrast photo from the August 2011 folder, a jagged, severed brake line that looked less like a mechanical failure and more like a surgical strike. The sharp, metallic scent of the oil in the photograph seemed to trigger a phantom memory of burnt rubber and hot asphalt. I was transported back to that terrifying afternoon in Seattle. I remembered the exact moment the brake pedal of my vintage truck hit the floorboard, without a hint of resistance. The panic was a cold spike in my chest as I swerved to miss a school bus, the screech of tires screaming against the pavement before a bone-shaking impact with a concrete barrier threw me forward. At the time, I was merely shaken and confused, but Elena's arrival had been the true blow. She didn't come with a hug or a word of comfort. She arrived with a lawyer and a cold clinical assessment for the police. She told them I was sundowning, that I could no longer be trusted behind the wheel. The brakes just died, Elena. I had pleaded, my hands still trembling from the crash. She had looked right through me. No, Brooks. Your reaction time died. We are selling the truck tomorrow. The sting of that helplessness had burned for 7 years. A resentment I had carried like a lead weight. Griffin had sat at the dinner table that night, with a smug, knowing smile nodding along as Elena stripped me of my independence. But as I sat in the sanctuary study, the truth revealed a much more predatory design. I discovered that Griffin had sabotaged the truck specifically on the day I was scheduled to drive my infant granddaughter Maya to the park. The realization made a cold sweat break across my neck. My own son was willing to sacrifice his niece just to ensure my accident looked like a senior's mistake. Crushed. The truck. My pride. All to hide a pair of wire snips. I looked at an invoice Elena had hidden away from a private mechanic she'd hired to inspect the wreckage before the insurance companies could touch it. The report was blunt. The lines were cut with heavy-duty wire snips. A secondary report contained a receipt for a disposal fee. Elena had paid triple to have my beloved truck crushed, immediately ensuring no evidence remained that could tip off Griffin that his attempt had been discovered. Have you ever hated someone for protecting you, only to realize your resentment was the only thing keeping you from seeing the monster in the room? I could almost hear the car crusher's rhythmic groan in my imagination. My anger at her control had been the very cloak she used to keep me from realizing I was a target in my own home. I realized the truck sale wasn't an act of dominance. It was a desperate act of preservation. A final private memo from Elena to herself sat at the bottom of the pile. She hadn't just pocketed the money from the sale. She had moved every cent into the Orcas security fund. She had turned Griffin's murder weapon into the very foundation of my protection here on this island. I turned the page and found a copy of a $450,000 promissory note with my signature on the bottom, a signature I knew with absolute certainty I had never written. The ink on the promissory note looked fresh even 7 years later, a blue-black stain on my reputation. The blue ink of my forged signature screamed off the page, a perfect imitation of a man who had no idea he was being legally executed in his own dining room. I sat in the sanctuary study, a phantom headache throbbing behind my temples, as the memory of May 2012 clawed its way back to the surface. It was a Tuesday family dinner, the air thick with the smell of roast lamb and expensive red wine. Leona Sterling had leaned back in her chair, casually bringing up a private debt she claimed I owed her for a failed real estate investment. I remember the sheer, staggering confusion that washed over me. I had never even heard of the company she mentioned. I produced a stammered denial, but Leona was ready. She produced this very note in front of everyone, passing it around like a trophy, while the grandchildren watched in wide-eyed silence. I felt a burning shame that made my ears ring. Elena hadn't defended me that night. She had snapped at me in front of the children, sighing about my failing memory and financial incompetence. That dinner had been the moment I truly began to doubt the structural integrity of my own mind. Ash. The note was mostly ash. A half-burned lie Elena kept as a trophy of my survival. I found the real May 2012 folder tucked behind a false panel in the binder. Inside was the original forged note, its edges charred from a flame that was never allowed to finish the job. Beside it lay a dry, clinical handwriting expert's report that Elena had commissioned in total secrecy. The expert confirmed the forgery with absolute certainty. Elena's monthly letter, written in her jagged, emotional hand, explained the brutal math of that month. She had to gaslight me in front of the children. She had to make them believe their debt trap was working, because if she had exposed the forgery, then they would have pivoted to a more violent method. What is harder to endure, a wife who hates you, or a wife who has to pretend she does to keep you out of a courtroom or a casket? The letter revealed that she had secretly neutralized the debt by paying Leona off with a private gift that carried a lethal non-disclosure clause. But there was a deeper layer to the counter-forgery. Elena hadn't just paid the money. She had forced Leona to sign a full written confession of the forgery as a condition of receiving the funds. I held the confession in my hands, feeling the weight of the leverage Elena had gathered, while I was busy fearing my own shadow. I realized the gaslighting was also a setup for a future legal battle. Elena wanted a house full of witnesses to her own public cruelty, so the children could never claim she and I were co-conspirators in hiding assets. She was building a court-ready defense of her own villainy. She paid them in blood so they wouldn't ask for mine, sacrificing my dignity to buy my safety. I felt a wave of anguish for the woman who had to sit across from me at dinner, watching me crumble while she held the proof of my innocence in her locked desk. I turned to the 2013 binder and saw a small plastic baggie stapled to the first page. It contained 2 identical white pills that I knew were never meant to heal me. The baggie crinkled under my thumb, the sound of a pharmaceutical death sentence echoing in the small study like the rattle of a snake. I stared at the 2 identical white pills inside, feeling a cold moisture bloom on my neck. I remembered 2013 as a year of vibrating horizons and a constant heavy thrumming in my skull. My blood pressure had become a ticking bomb, and the sound of blood rushing in my ears was a rhythmic warning I didn't know how to heed. I relived those mornings at the breakfast table in Madison Park, feeling my face flush and my heart hammer against my ribs, while Sloane Sterling watched me with a clinical, expectant smile. She was my youngest stepdaughter, the one I had read stories to, yet she sat there sipping her orange juice as if she were waiting for a grand finale. Elena had dismissed my blurry vision as old age whining whenever the children were around, her voice a sharp blade of public indifference. "I don't understand why I feel like my head is going to explode," I had whispered to her once in the kitchen. She had simply told me to lie down and stay there. I discovered the truth was far more sinister than aging. Sloane wasn't just acting on a whim of greed. She was using me as a test case for the sugar pill method, perfecting a way to accelerate an inheritance by quietly removing the obstacles. Have you ever sat across from someone you raised, watching them drink orange juice while they waited for your heart to fail? The binder contained the proof I never asked for: grainy black and white hidden camera stills of Sloane entering the kitchen at midnight, her face illuminated by the refrigerator light, as she systematically replaced my lisinopril with those clinical, sweet-tasting placebos. But the horror was matched by a staggering revelation of love. The next set of photos showed Elena entering that same kitchen at 3 in the morning, night after night, for 8 long months. 8 months. 240 nights. One woman standing in the dark with a bottle of truth. I could almost smell the faint scent of her 3 a.m. coffee lingering on the yellowed pages of the binder. Elena would painstakingly swap the sugar pills back for real medication she had procured through an offshore pharmacy. I read her notes about the bone-deep exhaustion she endured, staying awake until the house was dead silent, just to ensure my heart didn't stop in my sleep. I watched my daughter try to kill you 300 times, and 300 times I chose you, her letter confessed. Every pill I placed back in that tray was a minute I stole from death. To keep the children from trying a more violent method, Elena had intentionally left a fake diary entry where she complained about my declining health, leading them to believe their sabotage was working. She was playing a high-stakes game of pretend with my life as the ante. The cold plastic feel of the pill organizer in the photos felt like a phantom weight in my own hands. I realized the sheer physical and emotional toll it must have taken on her to play the villain by day and my guardian angel by night. I turned to the 2014 folder, but the first thing I saw wasn't a letter. It was a hospital wristband with my name on it, stained with a single dried drop of blood. The hospital band was brittle, the plastic snapping as I touched it, just like my health had snapped on that cold February morning in 2014. I held the jagged remains in the quiet of the sanctuary study, the sharp phantom scent of hospital antiseptic stinging my nostrils. That day remains a jagged shard in my memory. I was in the Madison Park kitchen, the cold light of winter bleeding through the windows, trying to pour a simple cup of coffee. Suddenly the world skewed. A metallic copper taste flooded my mouth, the unmistakable signature of a TIA mini-stroke. I watched helpless as the left side of my body turned to lead. The porcelain cup slipped from my unfeeling fingers and shattered on the stone tile with a sound like a gunshot. I collapsed into a chair, my speech slurring as I tried to call for help. Elena was there, standing in the doorway, her face a mask of unyielding stone. She didn't rush to my side. She didn't scream. She simply looked at me and told me I was making a mess of the tile, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. I remember the deepest wound of that morning wasn't the stroke itself, but the isolation of her gaze. Griffin appeared behind her, ostensibly calling 911, but I discovered the truth in the folder. He had intentionally delayed the call by 3 minutes, pretending to be on a work crisis while I lay there dying. He wanted those extra seconds to be the margin of my failure. I read the February 2014 letter, now my fingers tracing the blurred ink where Elena's tears had hit the page 35 years later. She confessed that she almost broke her cover that morning, every instinct screaming at her to hold me. but she had seen Griffin in the shadows of the dining room with a stopwatch in his hand. A stopwatch. My son was timing my death like it was a 100-meter dash. He wasn't waiting for the paramedics to save me. He was clocking my expiration to see if the delay was sufficient. Elena revealed that the stroke had happened because she had failed to catch a single night's pill swap. She had been fighting the early racking fevers of her own stage 4 cancer and had fallen into a heavy, exhausted sleep. That was the day I stopped being their mother and became their judge, she wrote. How does a woman mourn the children who are still sitting at her dinner table, knowing she has to send them to hell to save her husband? It was a eulogy for the living. She realized then that her children were beyond redemption sociopaths who viewed their father as a timed event. The letter became a frantic blueprint for the months that followed. She began her cancer treatments in secret that same February, realizing her own clock was ticking faster than mine. She needed to finalize the sanctuary to turn this island into a permanent fortress before her strength failed. I felt the weight of her hidden war pressing down on me. While I had been recovering in a sterile ward, she had been fighting 2 different deaths, mine and her own. I turned to the October 2017 folder expecting more of her protective prose, but instead, I found a legal summons. It was thick and cold, a weapon of paper and ink. The children hadn't even waited for her to die before they tried to bury me, legally launching a strike that made the physical attempts on my life look merciful. The legal summons was thick, a weapon of paper and ink designed to strip me of my name and my freedom while Elena was still fighting for her last breaths. I turned the dry, papery sheets with a hand that shook from a mix of indignation and a lingering, bitter taste in the back of my throat. It was October 2017. I remembered the Madison Park mansion feeling like a siege camp. My 4 stepchildren, Griffin, Leona Maddox, and Sloane, had presented a unified front filing to have me declared legally incompetent. They used my previous mini-stroke and my choice to withdraw from social circles as evidence of a mounting dementia. In their predatory math, my devotion to Elena's bedside was nothing more than the wandering mind of a senile old man. I discovered a deeper rot in the binder. The children had actually tried to bribe Elena's hospice nurse to testify that I was neglectful and abusive during her final days. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound. "We are just doing this for your own protection," Brooks Griffin had said during one of those staged visits. "You can't even remember where you put the car keys." I had looked him in the eye, my voice as steely as the bridges I used to inspect, and told him that I hadn't lost the keys, but that his mother had sold the truck. Have you ever seen a dying woman summon the strength of a hurricane just to sign a piece of paper that would save your soul? The binder contained a transcript of a secret deposition Elena gave from her hospital bed just 3 weeks before she died. In the quiet sanctuary study, I could almost smell the sharp, clinical tang of hospital-grade disinfectant as I read her words. She was gaunt, her body failing, but her mind was the sharpest blade in the room. She provided the judge with everything: the SD cards of the staircase, oiling the mechanic's reports of the cut brake lines, and the medical logs of the sugar pill swaps. She didn't just defend me, she dismantled them. My husband is the most stable structure in this family, she had testified with Alaric Prescott at her side. My children are the ones with the rot in their foundations. Incompetent. That was the word they used. But it was their greed that lacked a brain. The judge had dismissed the case in a closed-door hearing, noting the suspicious activity of the petitioners. Elena's testimony was her final act as their mother. She claimed she was protecting them from the crime of destroying a good man, though I saw it for what it truly was, a death blow to their aspirations. The realization hit me with a profound solemnity. Elena had used her final agonizing months to ensure my legal standing was ironclad. She revealed in the binder that the conservatorship battle was the exact trigger she needed to legally freeze their trust funds. By proving their attempted fraud, she initiated a mandatory ethics audit that would keep their inheritances tied up in red tape for years. She had left them the money, but she had taken away their ability to touch it. I turned to the final folder, March 2021, and found a handwritten note that simply said, "Brooks, I've left you the weapon. Now you must decide if you have the heart to fire it." The final folder was thin, containing only a single sheet of paper and a small black USB drive, the hardware for a vengeance I wasn't sure I wanted to claim. I broke the seal of the March 2021 folder with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a steely, quiet resolve. I inserted the drive into the laptop on the mahogany desk, and the soft hum of the machine felt like the heartbeat of the house. A video file sat at the top of the directory. I clicked it, and suddenly Elena was there, vibrant and whole, recorded on a final, ordinary day, just weeks before the end. She wasn't the cold matriarch or the dying patient. She was the woman I had married, her eyes bright with a love she had spent 35 years masking. She spoke directly to the camera, telling me that she never lost her memory of us, not for a single second. It was the ultimate entry twist to my new reality. The long con hadn't just been a legal shield, but a living sacrifice. I turned my attention to the last letter, the 420th installment of her silent vigil. She dropped every defense, pouring out her reasons for the decades of calculated cruelty. She asked for my forgiveness for the years of silence that had felt like a slow-motion execution. The USB drive, she explained, was the master key. It held the access codes to the children's frozen trusts and the compiled evidence of their crimes, the staircase sabotage, the brake lines, the pill swaps. "Be free, Brooks." Her steady signature seemed to pulse on the page. "I've built the walls, but you are the one who decides who gets to walk through the gate. I loved you in every silence, in every cold glance, and in every letter I hid from the world." The 420 letters were the bricks of a fortress I hadn't known I lived in until the roof was finished. I sat on the hard oak floor, leaning my back against the mahogany desk, as the warm, golden light of the island dawn began to creep across the room. The smell of old paper mixed with the fresh, salt-tinged sea air blowing in through the cracked window. Free. Not from the house. Not from the children. Free from the lie. 35 years of believing I was a burden, a butler, a mistake, all of it dissolved into a profound, bone-deep peace. I wasn't a victim of a cruel wife. I was the protected treasure of a brilliant one. "You didn't leave me, Elena," I whispered into the morning light. "You just went ahead to finish the bridge." I realized that by giving me the master key, she had performed one final power reversal. I was now the sole trustee of the children's lives. I held the power to decide if they ever saw a single penny of the sterling fortune again, or if they spent their remaining years answering for the blood they tried to spill. The weight of 3 decades of confusion was gone, replaced by a serenity so absolute it felt like a foundation beneath my legs. The world was quiet. The only sound, the distant rhythm of the waves hitting the cliffs below. As the light hit the binders, turning their white spines into a wall of gold, I saw a small, red light blinking on the study's intercom, a signal from the front gate that someone had just breached the perimeter. The intercom buzzed again, a sharp intrusion into the first moment of peace I'd known in half a lifetime. I didn't answer the intercom. Instead, I opened the offshore server link Elena had provided, watching through a digital window as the monsters I'd helped raise began to tear themselves apart in Seattle. The blue, flickering light of the computer screen in the dark study was the only illumination as I scrolled through a curated archive of their recent movements. I discovered that the siblings had already started fighting over my former quarters and the family silver before the will was even dry, their unity as fake as the manufactured tears they had shed at the funeral. I accessed a file from a high-end Seattle steakhouse recorded just 4 days after we buried Elena. On the screen, the smell of expensive cigars seemed to waft through the digital memory. Griffin was loud and boisterous, leaning back with a glass of $5,000 wine. He was toasting to my departure, laughing as he handed out keys to a $500,000 Lamborghini he'd bought on credit. "I hope the old man likes the taste of canned soup in that island dump," Maddox sneered, while Leona toasted to finally cutting the dead weight. Their greed was a spectacle, a feast of vultures celebratory over a kill that wasn't actually theirs. A Lamborghini, $1 million bet, a $5,000 toast, all built on the sand of a dying woman's mercy. I watched the footage shift to several weeks later, captured by hidden cameras within the Madison Park Mansion's library. The boisterous laughter had vanished, replaced by the rhythmic red blinking of a crisis. I watched Griffin's face turn a mottled purple with rage as Alaric Prescott informed them over a speakerphone that their primary trust accounts had been flagged for an ethics audit. The boisterous celebration had collapsed into a frantic panic. Maddox, losing his composure, hurled a crystal glass against the stone fireplace. It shattered with a sharp, final crack. He had just learned his $1 million Vegas credit line was cut off, while Sloane sat nearby hyperventilating as she realized a crypto scam had wiped out her remaining liquid savings. Have you ever watched a predator realize they've been the ones caught in the snare the entire time? They were screaming at Alaric, demanding to know how their money could be subject to a conduct review. They didn't understand that Elena had built a cage out of their own impulses. "Mother wouldn't do this," Sloane wailed, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. That bridge inspector must have poisoned her mind at the end. They still couldn't see the truth. They had poisoned themselves. The digital logs revealed a final desperate act of cowardice. Griffin had attempted to forge a codicil to the will just last week, trying to claw back the assets Elena had placed out of reach. But the system Elena built was a trap with a hair trigger. It automatically flagged the forgery and reported him to the ethics board before he could even hit save. As the video looped back to their smug faces at the steakhouse, a new alert flashed on my screen, a GPS ping from a rental van that had just exited the ferry ramp only 3 miles from my front door. The vultures were coming to the island, but they were no longer looking for a feast. They were coming to beg for their lives. The phone on the desk rang its vibration, rattling the binders like a warning bell. I didn't need to answer it to know that the calm of Orcas Island was about to be shattered by the frantic heartbeat of 4 desperate sterling heirs. I reached out my fingers, brushing the cool spine of the March 2021 binder before I finally picked up the receiver. Saskia's voice was a low rasp on the other end, urgent, and cutting through the hum of the security monitors. She confirmed what the GPS had already whispered: the rental van was carrying Griffin, Leona, Maddox, and Sloane. They looked frantic and disheveled at the ferry landing. She told me, describing them as people who had been sleeping in their suits, their former polish stripped away by the cold reality of frozen accounts. Saskia warned me that they weren't here for a tearful reunion. They had hired a local locksmith and a private security guard to force their way into what they still believed was a squalid island ruin. A small, steely smile touched my lips when she mentioned the locksmith. I discovered that the man they'd hired was actually Saskia's own nephew, meaning I would have full knowledge of their every clumsy move before they even touched the lock. "Let them come, Saskia," I said, my voice as steady as the fieldstone walls surrounding me. The gates were built for exactly this kind of weather. I hung up and sipped my peppermint tea, the warmth a sharp contrast to the gray, choppy sea visible through the study window. I moved with a calm I hadn't possessed 40 years ago, transitioning from the observer to the architect of their final lesson. I used the estate's command console to activate the internal security protocols Elena had meticulously designed, the smell of ozone from the monitors filling the room. I didn't prepare a weapon. I prepared the truth. I gathered the insurance folders, the physical evidence of the oiled stairs, the severed brake lines, and the swapped pills, and carried them downstairs. The Sterling children were like floodwaters, mindless, destructive, and looking for the easiest way to drown anything of value. I placed the folders meticulously on the dining room table, the cold, smooth feel of the cardstock, a reminder of the weight they carried. I arranged the chairs so that I would be framed by the massive stone fireplace, assuming the role of the judge Elena always knew I could be. It was time to show them what adequate compensation really looks like. 45 years of bridge inspection had taught me one thing: you can't hide a structural failure forever. disheveled, desperate, debt-ridden. The 3 Ds of a sterling downfall were about to collide with the one thing they couldn't buy or bully my memory. As I sat there, the vibration of the heavy stone walls signaled the van's approach. I checked the forest surveillance feed one last time. Griffin was leading the pack, clutching a heavy document tube against his chest. I realized then that they weren't just here to squat in a house. They had forged a new deed to the property, a final desperate paper shield against their own ruin. I watched the monitors as the white rental van turned onto Oakwood Lane, the dust cloud behind it rising like a signal fire for the war that was finally arriving at my door. I stood up, adjusting my collar, and walked toward the porch to meet the storm. I didn't hide in the shadows. I walked onto the porch and sat in Elena's high-backed wicker chair, letting the island sun hit my face as the gates groaned open like the jaws of a trap. The rhythmic creak of the wicker under my weight was the only sound in the sudden stillness of the afternoon. I didn't reach for a weapon or a phone. Instead, I placed a small side table next to my chair with a single glass of water and the black USB drive. I had already wired the porch for sound and video, and as I sat there, I knew that every word and every movement was being broadcast directly to Alaric Prescott's legal server as a live, indelible deposition. I watched the white rental van crawl up the quarter-mile driveway, its engine struggling and whining against the steep incline. It was a perfect metaphor for the sterling name straining, overheating, and ultimately failing against a foundation it could no longer dominate. For 45 years, I had been the help, the man who inspected the bridges while others walked across them. Today, I was the only one who truly belonged on this soil. Just like inspecting a bridge, I told myself you wait for the tension to snap before you call the failure. They think they're coming home, but they're just walking into a courtroom. I took a slow, cold sip of the water, letting the refreshing liquid steady my pulse. I could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, a white shroud for the life they thought they were reclaiming. Before I reveal the truth behind the document tube Griffin is clutching, are you still with me? Choose A if you think I should show them mercy, or B if I should let the evidence destroy them, and add one short reason why, so I can see your perspective. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the core message is what I hope stays with you. The van door slid open. The smell of fear and cheap fast food followed them out. The Sterlings had arrived. They emerged like actors from a low-rent tragedy, their expensive suits wrinkled and stained from the journey. Griffin Sterling took the lead, his face already turning a familiar, arrogant shade of red as he spotted me sitting above him. He was clutching that heavy document tube as if it were a scepter, his knuckles white. Behind him, Leona and Maddox looked like ghosts of their former selves, while Sloane hung back, her hand gripped tightly around a small, concealed pepper spray canister. They had come prepared for a fight, but they weren't prepared for the man waiting for them. "You've had your little vacation," Brooks Griffin barked, stopping at the foot of the stairs. "Now get your bags and get off our property." Leona sneered, looking around at the meticulously kept grounds with a confusion that was rapidly turning into fresh greed. "Look at him," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Sitting there like he's the king of the island. It's pathetic." I didn't stand up. I didn't even blink. Griffin took the first step onto the porch, his eyes locking onto the USB drive on the table. And for a second, I saw the exact moment he realized he wasn't looking at a victim, but at a man holding the detonator. I didn't stand up to greet them. I stayed rooted in Elena's chair, watching the entitlement bleed out of Griffin's face as he realized my silence was a fortress he couldn't bully his way through. I didn't stand up. I didn't even blink. I just watched Griffin's polished shoe touch the first stone step of my sanctuary, the leather scuffed and salt-crusted from his desperate journey. Maddox, ever the opportunist, sensed the sudden shift in gravity and pushed past a stuttering Griffin. He offered a weak, desperate apology, his face a frantic mask of feigned regret. "Brooke's dad. Look, things got heated in the city," he stammered, reaching out for a reconciliation I knew was as hollow as his bank account. "We were all just confused by grief. We just want to talk about Mother's real wishes." He attempted to pull me into a hug, a sign of family unity for the hidden cameras he assumed I didn't have. I physically sidestepped him with the practiced ease of a man avoiding a structural hazard. Maddox stumbled, and as he tried to catch his balance, a small silver recording device tumbled out of his jacket pocket and clattered onto the porch. Have you ever heard a man apologize with his mouth, while his eyes were already calculating the value of the watch on your wrist? I didn't answer him. I let the sound of the crashing Pacific waves fill the awkward gaps in his plea, my gaze steady and unforgiving. The other sibling stood behind him, a mixture of disgust at Maddox's cowardice and a mounting terror at my unwavering composure. "We can start over, can't we?" Maddox pleaded, his voice cracking. "For family's sake, silence." It was my only weapon, and it was cutting them to ribbons. I finally broke the quiet, not with a word, but by picking up the black USB drive from the side table. I stood with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who owned every inch of this cliffside, ignoring Griffin's document tube and Leona's snarled threats inside. "All of you." I commanded, my voice low and vibrating with an authority they had never heard before. I gestured toward the heavy oak front door and led the silent, fuming group into the house. As we entered the hallway, the siblings were visibly shaken. This wasn't the ruin they had described to the lawyers in Seattle. It was a high-end estate meticulously maintained and filled with the scent of Elena's signature perfume, a floral ghost that seemed to mock their presence. "Is that a photo of him from last year?" Leona whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the hundreds of framed photos lining the walls. "How long has she been hiding this place?" They walked with heavy breathing and sweating brows, their expensive but ruined clothes looking absurd against the backdrop of Elena's lifelong devotion to the man they tried to erase. The salt-crusted feeling of their failure seemed to hang in the air like a fog. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped at the study door, the silver key in my hand, feeling cold and smooth against my palm. I turned the lock, the sharp click sounding like a gunshot in the hallway where my children's futures were about to die. I pushed the door open, revealing the nerve center of Elena's long game. The study was exactly as I had left it. 420 binders of truth, standing guard against 4 people built of lies. The study didn't just hold binders. It held the ghosts of the nights my children tried to kill me. And as the lights flickered on, those ghosts finally stepped into the light. I opened the heavy oak door and gestured for the siblings to enter the center of Elena's secrets. They moved tentatively, their frantic energy curdling into a heavy, suffocating dread. I walked behind the mahogany desk, the leather chair creaking as I sat assuming the role of the judge Elena always knew I could be. I gestured to the wall of 420 binders, their white spines standing like a jury in the dim light. "You thought the house was the inheritance, Griffin," I said, my voice cutting through their heavy breathing. "These folders are your real legacy." I picked up the insurance folders and began to methodically lay them out on the desk like a hand of cards, the sound of paper sliding across the wood sharp in the silence. My fingers brushed the cool surface of the black USB drive, a reminder of the power I now held. The entry twist hit them first. I turned over a file showing not just their attacks on me, but evidence of them plotting against each other to increase their individual shares. Maddox blanched as he saw a transcript of Leona suggesting he be handled if he didn't stop gambling away their future. They crowded around the desk, their initial arrogance dissolving into a cold, metallic sweat. Evidence. Not just ink and paper. The scent of my own near death bound in leather. Is that the oil I used in 2010? Maddox whispered, his eyes bulging as he stared at a high-resolution photo. How did she find it? I didn't answer him. Instead, I activated the wall monitor, the blue light reflecting off their pale, terrified faces. I played the clip of Maddox applying the lubricant to the stairs, followed by the mechanic's report on the cut brake lines and the lab results of Sloane's sugar pill swap. Look at their faces. Can you see it? That's the look of four people realizing they've spent 30 years hunting a man who was already holding the keys to their prison cells. Each act, attempted murder, elder abuse forgery, carried a weight that would bury them. I explained that Elena had already filed these with a maritime legal server. It would automatically release the evidence to the district attorney if I didn't enter a safety code every 48 hours. You didn't just want the money, Sloane, I said, looking at her as she trembled. You wanted to watch me stop breathing. I turned to Griffin, who was still clutching his document tube. I informed him that the property he tried to claim was classified as a conservation sanctuary. It could never be sold for development, rendering his forged deed a worthless scrap of paper, even if he succeeded in removing me. Elena wasn't just a CEO, I told them, my voice cold and absolute. She was a bridge inspector just like me. She found every crack in your souls. The siblings stood in paralyzed silence, the reality of their exposure sinking in like stones in a lake. I closed the last folder and looked at Griffin, whose face had gone from the red of rage to the gray of a man who had just seen his own executioner smile. The silence in the study was no longer a peace. It was a gallows. Do you know what the structural load of a lie is? I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of Griffin's heavy, panicked breathing. I leaned back in Elena's chair, watching as the four of them stood huddled together like cattle in a storm. On the wall monitor, a digital progress bar pulsed blue, a live upload of the USB drive to Alaric's offshore legal server. The state of Washington calls what you did first-degree murder attempt, I said, with a calmness that seemed to terrify them more than a scream. I call it a failure of character. I watched the document tube Griffin had been clutching, like a scepter, hit the floor with a hollow plastic thud. Mother wouldn't, he croaked, his voice cracking like dry wood. She wouldn't send us to prison. I didn't blink. She didn't want you in cages, Griffin, but she wouldn't allow you to remain as you are. I revealed the first blow of their new reality. I had already used the master key to settle their immediate predatory debts. I was now their sole creditor. I owned their mortgages, their credit lines, and their very financial existence. They didn't even have the luxury of bankruptcy. They owed their lives to the man they tried to erase. $20 an hour. From a Lamborghini to a shovel. That is the sterling exchange rate today. I laid the redemption contract on the desk, the paper cold and dry under the study lights. The terms were absolute. Griffin, you will surrender yourself for a pre-negotiated 4-year sentence for the brake line tampering. You'll be a paralegal for the indigent behind bars using the law to help someone other than yourself. Maddox, you'll work the island's construction projects for minimum wage while maintaining strict tested sobriety. Leona and Sloane, you will manage the farm and the future shelter. You will live in the worker cottages at the base of the hill, stripped of your designers and your status. Look at them. They came here to take a house, and they're leaving with a job. Mercy is the heaviest thing I've ever had to carry. I took a final sip of the iron-heavy island water, the taste grounding me in the present. If there is any deviation, I warned, if I see one sign of the old greed or a single step out of line, the stay on the legal upload is removed. You will face 25 years to life. Mother's parents, the ones who taught you these games, died penniless because Elena drained their accounts years ago to fund this very sanctuary. She knew the rot went back 2 generations, and she cut it out at the root. Sloane's cloying, expensive perfume seemed to fade in the stale air of the room, replaced by the scent of old paper and the reality of hard labor. You will earn $20 an hour, I repeated. You will sweat. You will bleed. And you will thank me for the opportunity to become human again. They stared at me in a state of total submission, the shock of their transition from heirs to laborers finally settling into their bones. I stood up and slid the USB drive toward the center of the desk, the small black piece of plastic looking like a hand grenade with the pin halfway pulled. I waited for the first of them to break, for the first confession to crack the silence of the room. The room was so quiet, I could hear the gears of the antique clock on the mantel, each tick a second of their old lives slipping away. I stood up and slid the USB drive toward the center of the desk. The small black piece of plastic looking like a hand grenade with the pin halfway pulled. Sloane was the first to snap. The sound of her designer heels hitting the floor as she fell to her knees was the most honest thing I'd heard in this house since Elena's heart stopped. She broke down into hysterical, ugly sobs, her cloying perfume mixing with the sharp scent of salt and genuine terror. "I didn't want to do it," she wailed, her hands clutching at the mahogany edge of my desk. "Griffin said it was the only way to save our shares. He said you were just an obstacle." She admitted through gasps of air that her failed resort development had left her so debt-ridden that the thought of poverty had overridden her soul. I watched her with a mixture of pity and a strange clinical detachment. Behind her, Griffin, Maddox, and Leona recoiled. They weren't disgusted by her betrayal of me, but by her weakness in breaking the family's wall of silence. "Look at you, Sloane," Griffin hissed, his face a mask of predatory contempt. "You're pathetic. We were this close to the deed." I let the silence stretch, watching the digital upload complete bar glow blue on the wall monitor. Have you ever seen a king realize his crown was made of cardboard while his kingdom burned around him? Griffin's eyes darted toward the monitor, then back to the contract on my desk. The transition was visceral. Maddox, sensing the finality of the trap, chose that moment to reveal his own hidden insurance. He pulled a phone from his pocket, explaining that he had been recording Griffin's private admissions of fraud and breakline sabotage for months, just in case he needed leverage. The siblings were no longer a unit. They were a pile of dry timber, and I was the match. One by one, they realized the forged deed was a worthless scrap of paper against the weight of the folders I had laid out. The pen, a simple plastic bic, might as well have been a death warrant for the people they used to be. Griffin was the last to yield. His hands shook with a violent tremor as he picked up the pen to sign the redemption contract. By signing, he accepted a 4-year prison term for the truck sabotage, while his siblings bound themselves to the island's labor. "You're a monster, Brooks." He spat the ink, scratching harshly against the heavy paper. "Worse than mother." I met his gaze with the calm of a man who had seen every bridge failure imaginable. "No, Griffin," I said. "I'm just the inspector, and your foundation just failed." As they each added their signatures, the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long purple shadows into the study. The hierarchy had been permanently inverted. I informed them that their phone signals had been jammed since they crossed the gate, a final security layer Elena had insisted upon. They were completely cut off, isolated from the world, and the lawyers they thought would save them. The orange and purple light of the sunset reflected off the picture frames of my life, a silent audience to their downfall. I stood on the porch as the 4 people I had raised walked toward the small worker cottages in the dark, the first frost of autumn beginning to bite at the air they now had to earn. Winter on Orcas Island doesn't just bite the skin. It gnaws at the ego, stripping away the designer labels until all that's left is the raw, shivering truth of survival. The first morning in the cottages was silent save for the sound of a wood-burning stove and the realization that their old lives were gone. I watched from the main house as the frost of November turned the emerald forest into a skeletal silver graveyard. My stepchildren emerged from their dwellings not in Italian wool or silk, but in the generic heavy-duty canvas and denim I had purchased from the island's local hardware shop. I had already made a trip to the mainland to donate their confiscated wardrobes to a local thrift store, ensuring that the only remnants of their corporate royalty were the blisters beginning to form on their soft palms. Maddox and Leona were assigned to the construction site under the watchful eye of Saskia's lead foreman. Maddox, a man who once managed hedge funds with the flick of a finger, was now tasked with clearing rocky debris for the new shelter's foundation in the freezing mud. I could see the steam rising from his breath as he struggled with a rusted wheelbarrow. "My hands are bleeding, Brooks," he shouted across the yard when he saw me. "This is inhumane." I didn't move from my post. "Pain is just your body's way of remembering it's alive, Maddox. Keep digging." The work log was the only thing standing between him and a felony indictment, and we both knew it. $20 an hour. Maddox used to lose that much in the time it took him to sneeze. Now he was earning it through the honest friction of stone against steel. Down at the farm, Leona was winterizing the greenhouses, hauling heavy bags of compost through a wind that carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Her initial attempts at rebellion, throwing down her shovel and demanding a lawyer, were met only with my stony silence. Griffin was already gone, processed into a state facility 2 days prior, and his absence hung over the grounds like a warning that needed no translation. By December, the freezing rain turned to a biting, crystalline sleet. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, serving hot tea to the local plumber and a pair of carpenters. We spoke of bridge tolerances and island politics, while my stepchildren ate their lunch of simple vegetable soup, huddled together in the mud like refugees from a world they no longer recognized. "I saw you drinking tea with the plumber, Brooks," Leona hissed as she walked past to empty a bucket. "Have you no dignity?" I took a slow sip of the hot liquid, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "He's built more bridges than you've ever seen, Leona. Right now, he's the only one in this yard with any real value." Their arrogance was a structure with a failed foundation, and the island winter was the seismic event that would finally bring it down. I watched the psychological toll manifest in their slumped shoulders and the way they stopped looking at the horizon and started looking at their feet. Habit, however, is a resilient weed. During a routine check of the cottages, I found a hidden stash of expensive scotch tucked behind a loose floorboard in Maddox's room. I walked out into the yard and poured the amber liquid into the fresh snow, watching it freeze into a bitter ice. I looked up at the sky just as the first scream of the winter gale hit the windows, knowing the storm was only beginning. The snow piled up against the study glass, a white wall that felt like the final page of their old lives turning. Sloane didn't walk into the study with the clicking heels of a predator anymore. She walked with the heavy, silent tread of someone who had spent the last month counting her own sins in the dark. I watched her from my desk, noting the smell of cold, damp wool and the cheap institutional soap provided to the cottages that now clung to her skin. Her designer complexion had gone pale. Her hands were visibly calloused from weeks of greenhouse labor, and the arrogance in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow, searching look. Before she sat, I noticed a smudge of fresh soil on her knees. I had discovered earlier that morning that Sloane had been secretly using her limited free time to tend to Elena's memorial garden in the freezing mist. It wasn't an assignment. It was a form of private penance I hadn't expected. I sat in the corner of the room, a silent witness to her court-mandated teletherapy session. The blue flickering light of the laptop screen illuminated her red-rimmed, unmasked eyes as Dr. Aris, a clinical specialist from Seattle, began the interrogation. I wasn't trying to kill him. Dr. Sloane whispered, her fingers picking at the rough fabric of her work trousers. I just needed the timeline to move faster. The sterling legacy. It was everything. The doctor's voice was a sharp contrast to the wind whistling through the study's eaves. You were managing a death clock, Sloane. Own the term. Apologies are like bridge supports. If they aren't anchored in truth, they're just expensive pieces of junk waiting to collapse under pressure. I watched Sloane flinch at the words. She tried to deflect, pointing the finger at Griffin's intimidation and the crushing pressure of her mother's expectations. But the doctor remained unyielding. For the first time, Sloane had no PR spin to hide behind. The silence that followed the end of the call was absolute, broken only by the settling of the house. She cried. Not the I'm caught cry, the I'm empty cry. She sat there for a long time, her calloused fingers gripping the edges of the wooden chair until her knuckles turned white. Brooks, she said, her voice small and devoid of its usual silver edge. I remember 1977. I remember when you fixed that broken porcelain doll after Griffin threw it down the stairs. I haven't thought about that in years. I realized I can't remember the last time I felt like a human being instead of a shareholder. She looked at me, then her gaze direct and raw. I'm not saying this so you'll let me leave. I'm saying it because I'm sorry. Not for the loss of the money, for the pills, for thinking you were less than us because you worked with your hands. It was the first real word spoken by a sterling child in decades, a clumsy, unpolished admission that felt heavier than any legal document. But then her expression shifted, a flicker of the old fear returning. Leona and Maddox. They aren't like me, Brooks. They're planning to steal the USB drive during the spring thaw. They think if they destroy the evidence, the audit stops. I watched her walk back into the snow, her warning about the USB drive echoing in the quiet study, like the first creak of a failing timber. My heart was wary, but for the first time since I arrived on this island, it was also slightly hopeful. The first thaw began with a sound like a gunshot, ice breaking on the sound, and the brothers' patience breaking in the cottages. I watched through the mud-spattered lens of the sight camera as Maddox Sterling, a man who once wouldn't ruin a $5,000 suit to save his own mother, dived shoulder-deep into the freezing slush to keep a concrete form from collapsing on a fellow worker. I had intentionally let Maddox find a bottle of bourbon earlier in the winter as a stress test, knowing that for a man like him, sobriety had to be a chosen fortress, not a mandated cage. He hadn't touched it yet, but the real trial arrived with the shifting earth. A sudden violent groan of wood echoed across the site as a support timber splintered like a dry bone. Caleb, a 19-year-old islander with dirt-smudged cheeks and the sturdy build of a lifelong fisherman, looked at Maddox with a terror that only a collapsing trench can inspire. The boy was pinned, the weight of the thawing iron-rich mud threatening to crush his lungs. Maddox didn't hesitate. He grabbed a crowbar and threw his entire physical being against the failing brace. "Don't let go!" Sterling the foreman screamed as the trench wall shuddered. "If that timber slips, he's gone." Maddox's face was a mask of agonizing effort, his veins bulging as he fought the laws of physics. "I've got him," he grunted through clenched teeth. "Just get the damn jack and move sweat. Blood. Mud." The Sterling trio of failure was finally being replaced by the Sterling trio of labor. By the time I arrived on the scene, Caleb had been pulled free, and Maddox was slumped against the foundation covered in filth with a deep bleeding gash on his forearm. He looked more present, more anchored to the earth than I had seen him in 30 years. "You did good, Maddox," I said, watching as Caleb's father stepped forward to shake his hand. "Your hands, they finally look like they've done a day's work." The gratitude he received wasn't the polite plastic variety bought with a donation. It was earned in the dirt. Can a man rebuild his soul with the same hands he used to try and dismantle his father's life? That evening, the smell of wet concrete clung to the air as Maddox retreated to his cottage. He was exhausted, every muscle a screaming reminder of his exertion. I watched through the window as he reached into the shadows for the hidden bourbon, his fingers trembling with the onset of withdrawal. He caught his reflection in the mirror. The mud and Caleb's blood still streaked across his skin. He stopped. "I don't need the ghost in the bottle to tell me who I am today," he whispered to the empty room. Caleb's father thanked me. He actually shook my hand. In a private, silent moment of transformation, he walked to the sink. The sharp, stinging scent of cheap bourbon hit the porcelain as he poured the amber liquid down the drain, accepting the tremors as the price of a real future. He was finally choosing the man over the heir. But the peace was short-lived. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled note Leona had slipped under his door during the chaos of the accident. It detailed a plan to sabotage the security server tonight, a final, desperate play for the drive. Maddox clutched Leona's note in his trembling, sober hand, the sound of the server room alarm suddenly echoing across the dark courtyard. The red strobe of the alarm cut through the mist, a warning light that the peace I'd built for the winter was officially over. I watched Leona through the study window as she knelt in the mud of the Victoria garden, her hands once manicured, to a porcelain sheen now stained with the dark, honest soil of Orcas Island. The alarm had faded into the quiet of a late spring morning, leaving behind a residue of cold clarity. Weeks ago, during that frantic server room incident, Leona had attempted to bypass the encryption to delete the evidence of her forgery. She had expected a digital firewall or a lockout. Instead, the system had simply displayed a high-definition video of Elena's final days. My wife had spent her last breaths looking into that camera, and Leona found herself staring into the silent, hollow eyes of the mother she had tried to defraud. The psychological weight of that gaze broke her more effectively than any prison sentence. "I didn't want the money tonight, Brooks," she had whispered, when I found her trembling in the server rack's blue glow. "I just wanted her to stop looking at me like that." I had told her then to stop giving her a reason to look away. I assigned her to the Victoria Garden, a plot of land named after Elena's mother, the very woman who had planted the seeds of greed in the Sterling bloodline. Leona was now literally weeding the legacy of the person who had ruined her family. A garden is just a slow-motion bridge. It requires the same integrity, the same constant inspection, and the same refusal to let the rot take hold. I spent the following month watching her from the porch, observing as she transformed from a predator into a caretaker. By mid-May, the garden was flourishing. I walked down the slope as the cool, wet feeling of the island mist clung to my skin, the air thick with the heavy, intoxicating smell of crushed tomato leaves and damp mulch. Leona was finishing a harvest of heirloom tomatoes and Victoria peppers, which glowed with a vibrant, almost neon violet hue against the dark earth. She didn't hear me approach at first. She was busy talking to the plants in a low rhythmic hum that reminded me of how Elena used to murmur to her binders in the study. Mud. It's the great equalizer. It doesn't care about your trust fund or your pedigree. I watched the way her dirt under the nails hands moved with a newfound gentleness, cradling the produce as if it were fragile glass. They survived the frost brooks, she said, standing up and wiping her forehead with a soiled forearm. I didn't think they would, but they did. I looked at the thriving rows of green and purple. You gave them a reason to stay rooted, I replied. That's more than most people do. She picked up the wicker basket, the wood creaking under the weight of the harvest, and turned to face me. The defiance that had defined her for 35 years had been replaced by something softer, something ancient. She held the basket out toward me, her eyes meeting mine without a hint of the old PR spin. "Here, Daddy," she said quietly. The word was more fragile than any heirloom sprout, a term of intimacy she hadn't uttered since the day the letters began in 1986. The word hung in the humid garden air, and for the first time in 3 decades, I felt the bridge between us stop swaying. I took the basket from her, the weight of the vegetables less than the weight of that single word. I left the island the next morning, the ferry crossing the Salish Sea under a canopy of heavy gray clouds that mirrored the gravity of my destination. The buzzing of the prison's heavy magnetic locks felt like a physical assault after a year of hearing nothing but the rhythmic breathing of the Pacific. I checked my pride at the door of the Monroe Correctional Complex and followed a guard through a series of echoing windowless hallways. I sat on a cold, clinical metal chair in the visiting room, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee heavy in the stagnant air. When the door on the opposite side opened, I was struck by how much the prison uniform had erased Griffin's corporate identity. Without the bespoke suits and the predatory arrogance of wealth, he looked remarkably like the young man I taught to fish in the late 70s. I discovered an entry twist of my own as I looked at him. He didn't know that I had been the one quietly paying for his legal defense and ensuring he wasn't targeted by other inmates, continuing Elena's tradition of silent protection. Griffin didn't start the conversation with legal demands or complaints about the food. He pressed his pale, unmanicured hands against the scratched glass partition. "Do you remember the bridge in Skagit?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "The one with the green paint. Was I actually there, Brooks? Or did I dream that I felt a pang of melancholy?" "You were there," I told him. "You held the tape measure while I checked the rivets. You were 7 years old. Monroe. Concrete and steel. The exact materials I spent my life inspecting. Only this time, the defect was human." He told me that since his accounts were frozen and his circle of vultures had vanished, his only currency had been the binders I sent him. The copies of the letters Elena had written about him. "They told me you were an intruder, Brooks." He confessed, his eyes searching mine through the glass. "But looking at these letters, I think I was the one who broke into your life." He asked if Elena ever actually loved him, or if he was just another structural failure she was trying to manage. "She loved the boy you were," I replied. "She spent 35 years trying to find him again." Can a uniform made of coarse polyester do what a lifetime of luxury couldn't? Can it make a man look at his father and see a person instead of an obstacle? Griffin looked down, his eyes welling with a repentance I never thought I'd see. He revealed a final plan of his own. He had used his time in the prison library to track the original offshore accounts his grandparents used to launder Elena's bonuses decades ago. He intended to use his limited legal access to return every cent to the Sanctuary Trust as restitution. I walked away from the glass, the sound of the high-security fences cutting through the blue sky outside. But when I looked back, Griffin wasn't watching the guards. He was staring at his own hands, the same way I used to, when I was trying to figure out how to bridge a gap that felt impossible. I saw the flash of the boy he had been before the greed took root, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man finally inspecting his own foundation. I didn't expect to see a line of cars winding up the forest road, but as the brass plaque for Victoria's Haven caught the afternoon sun, I realized Elena hadn't just built me a house. She'd built a legacy of survival. The golden light of the island dawn had matured into a rich, honeyed afternoon. I stood on the porch, watching the first group of domestic abuse survivors arrive at the sanctuary. The redemption contract I had forced upon my stepchildren contained a final entry twist they hadn't seen coming. They would eventually inherit this land, but only as joint trustees of the nonprofit. They could live here, they could work here, but they could never sell a single acre for profit. I watched Maddox, still in his dirt-stained work clothes, proudly showing a local islander the structural integrity of the newly finished wing. "The foundation is solid, Brooks," he called out to me with a grin that actually reached his eyes. I checked the load-bearing beams myself. In the kitchen, Leona was busy serving a meal entirely sourced from her garden. "Mother would have liked the violet peppers," she remarked as she set the centerpiece on the long oak table. "They're the heart of the harvest today." Even Sloane moved with a quiet, humble efficiency, handling the intake logistics with a grace that replaced her old corporate fire. The siblings were finally operating as a unit of service, fulfilling the spirit of their contract for the first time in their lives. "Is it possible to love the woman who broke you more than the woman who coddled you?" I saw the answer in the way they looked at the house, not as a prize to be won, but as a responsibility to be maintained. As the guests departed, and the air began to carry the scent of wet cedar and salt spray, the four of us gathered on the jagged cliff edge where the Fieldstone house meets the Pacific. The sound of the waves crashing hundreds of feet below was a rhythmic, grounding thrum. I brought out the simple wooden urn I had kept in my study for over a year. Gray ash, salt spray, the end of a 35-year storm. I held the urn out, and each sibling took a handful of the gritty remains. Their tears were unforced, now silver tracks, on faces that had been hardened by a year of honest labor. "Go find your peace," Elena Maddox whispered, as he let his portion fly into the wind. "We've got the bridge from here." "She gave us back our souls, didn't she?" Sloane asked, her voice catching on the salt, heavy breeze. I watched the white dust catch the spray and disappear into the vast, churning Salish sea, finally completing the intent of that 420th letter. The taste of salt on the wind was sharp and clean. I felt a profound sense of closure, the weight of the past finally sinking into the depths. But as the wind shifted, catching the very last of the remains, I felt something hard at the bottom of the wood. I reached in and found a final 421st envelope tucked into the velvet lining, a letter Elena had hidden for the specific day she was finally scattered. It was tiny and salt-stained, but her handwriting on the front was as steady and bold as the day we met. I pulled the small message from the urn, the ink reading, "For the man who rebuilt the bridge." The final letter didn't feel like paper. It felt like a warm hand resting on my shoulder, one last tether to the woman who had spent half a century playing the villain to remain my hero. I stood alone on the jagged cliffside, the paper warm in my grip, as if it had been holding onto the heat of the afternoon sun just for me. I broke the seal and let Elena's voice into my mind one last time. She admitted that the hardest part of her 4-decade performance wasn't the public cruelty or the legal maneuvering, but the quiet moments in our Madison Park kitchen when she had almost given in to the urge to tell me the truth. She wrote about the connection a bridge facilitates, reminding me that the structural integrity of a family, much like the steel and stone I had spent my life inspecting, depends on the strength of its deepest foundations. I discovered an entry twist that made me weep. Elena had maintained a second secret sanctuary fund, specifically for Griffin's rehabilitation, a ledger of hope, proving she had never truly given up on her firstborn. Forgive me for the silence, Brooks, the faded but clear ink read. I hope the island's music makes up for it. I felt a final total wave of forgiveness wash over me, not just for her, but for the man I was forced to be during those long, lonely years. You did it, Elena, I whispered to the salt-heavy wind. You brought us all home. He didn't look like a sterling anymore. He looked like a man. I walked back toward the house to find a familiar figure standing on the porch. It was Griffin, recently released on parole, after his tireless work uncovering the laundered funds and his service as a prison paralegal. The bespoke suits and golden watches were gone, replaced by simple, unbranded clothing that suggested a quiet humility. Without being asked, Griffin brought out a tray with 2 ceramic mugs. He walked with a meticulously silent respect, a mirror of the very role I had held for 35 years. Black 2 sugars, he said, his voice steady as he offered me the coffee. I haven't forgotten Brooks. I looked at him, seeing the strength in his eyes that had nothing to do with arrogance. How many years does it take for a son to learn that serving a good man is worth more than ruling a bad empire? He told me he wasn't here for the deed or the trust, but simply to help with the foundation of the haven. Then he delivered the final role reversal. Griffin told me that he had officially and legally changed his last name. He was no longer a Sterling. He was Griffin Brooks. He had chosen my identity over the toxic legacy of his mother's family, effectively crowning me as the father he finally recognized. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the morning air as the Pacific breathed against the cliffs below. I felt the warmth of the ceramic mug against my palm, grounding me in a reality I had once thought impossible. I took the cup from his hand, the steam rising between us, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a bridge inspector or a butler in the reflection. I saw a father. We sat together in silence, the steam from our cups mingling with the island mist 2 men built on a foundation of letters. The sound of a child's laughter skipped across the stone courtyard, a bright, melodic frequency that finally chased the last lingering shadows of Elena's silence from the corners of the estate. Maya, a 5-year-old with Elena's piercing gray eyes and a mop of unruly blonde curls, bounded across the grass with the fearless energy of someone who had never known the weight of a sterling secret. She carried a small decorative wooden box with a focused intensity that made me smile. Sloane had arrived with her, but it was Maya who led the way to the slope behind the Victoria Garden where we were gathering. I discovered an entry twist that Sloane had carefully arranged. The box Maya held contained a few scoops of soil from Elena's favorite garden back in Seattle. We were here to plant a legacy orchard of Honeycrisp apple trees, one for every member of the family, and Maya wanted to mix the 2 worlds together. I watched Griffin, Maddox, Leona, and Sloane pick up their shovels. They didn't argue about who had the hardest ground or who was doing more work. They moved with a synchronized rhythm that made me realize the redemption contract had finally evolved into something organic, a shared responsibility for a future they were building with their own hands. Maya tugged on my sleeve, pointing to a young sapling. "Grandpa, will this tree grow as tall as the house?" I knelt in the fresh, damp earth, the smell of young applewood sharp in the cold air. "You have to pack the soil firm, Maya," I told her, guiding her small hands. "A tree is only as strong as its foundation. If we take care of it, it'll grow taller than any secret we ever kept. A family is like an orchard. You can't just plant the trees and expect fruit. You have to endure the winters, prune the rot, and wait for the sun to do the work you can't." The golden, honey-thick light of the autumn sunset began to spill over the cliffs, reflecting off the brass Haven plaque and the gray Pacific below. Done. The letters, the lies, the labor, all of it. Done. I retreated to the study as the family began to head inside for dinner. The room was no longer a museum of trauma. It was a sanctuary of peace. I picked up a final empty binder and placed the salt-stained 421st letter inside. I realized then the final identity reveal the letter wasn't just dated for her scattering, but specifically for the day I would first hold my granddaughter on this island. Elena's foresight wasn't just about survival. It was a map to the joy she knew would follow the storm. I added a photograph of the family working together in the orchard and closed the ledger. I didn't feel the snap of anger I'd lived with for years, only the gentle, satisfied click of a bridge inspector who has finally seen the structure hold under its ultimate load. "The inspection is over, Elena," I whispered. "The bridge is standing. Good night, my love." I walked onto the porch and looked at the horizon, where the sea met the sky, in a line as straight and true as a well-built span. And I realized I wasn't waiting for a ferry anymore. I was already where I was meant to be. I sat in the wicker chair and watched the stars come out one by one over the haven. The island didn't just take Elena back. It had taken us all, smoothing over the jagged edges of our history until we were as worn and resilient as the cliffs themselves. I descended from the porch, my steps slow and deliberate, joining the family at the long outdoor table on the sanctuary terrace. The smell of roasted vegetables and sea salt hung heavy in the evening air, a perfume of hard-won peace. There was no butler tonight, no cold matriarch, and no desperate heirs, only a group of people who had survived a war of their own making. We ate in a shared silence that felt comfortable, almost holy, broken only by Maya's bright questions about the constellations. I watched Griffin now. Griffin Brooks pass a plate of warm bread to Maddox. "Pass the bread." Griffin Maddox said, his voice stripped of its old bite. "You earned the wheat this year." It was a simple gesture, but to me it felt like the final rivet being driven into a bridge we had spent 35 years building. "I think Mother would have finally liked the noise at this table," Sloane whispered, her eyes catching the reflection of the house lights. I realized then that my own journey had come to a structural resolution. I have secretly updated my own will to ensure that this island remains a sanctuary for all of them. But I've passed the legal stewardship to Griffin. He is the new inspector, now the one who will guard the foundation I spent my life fearing was gone. A sunset is just the earth closing a ledger for the day, and tonight the ink was finally dry. As the family moved inside to put Maya to bed, her melodic laughter echoing against the stone. Before fading into the house, I took a final walk to the very edge of the property. The rhythmic sound of the Pacific tide was a heartbeat beneath my feet. I stood where the fieldstone met the void, watching the lighthouse beam cut through the absolute dark of the sound. 19,000 words, 421 letters, one man, one bridge, final. I felt a sense of completion that no structural inspection could ever provide. "The load is balanced, Elena," I murmured into the salt spray. "We're standing." The sterling name had been repaired by the truth, or perhaps it had simply been replaced by something stronger. How many years had I spent looking for a defect? I realized I was finally standing on a span that wouldn't buckle. I looked toward the point where the lighthouse stood as a sentinel against the deep. I discovered in the local records that the tower had been named Elena's Light decades ago, long before her illness began. It was never just a maritime marker. It was her signal to bring me home a light she had kept burning through every year of our shared silence. I turned back toward the glow in the sanctuary windows. The warmth of the house lights a beacon against the night. The smooth silver key in my pocket felt finally weightless, a tool for a door that no longer needed to be locked. As the beam of Elena's light swept over me, heading out to sea, to search for the next soul that needed a way home, I walked toward my family. I wasn't waiting for a ferry anymore. I was already where I was meant to be. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized the greatest mistake I made was not the betrayal I endured. It was the silence I carried for so many years. I spent decades believing I was unwanted, believing my life had no value in that house. If there is one lesson I hope you take from this family story, it is this: never let silence replace truth. When resentment grows in the dark, it can poison an entire family story before anyone even understands what is happening. For a long time, I thought my life had turned into a bitter dad revenge tale, one where anger was the only answer. But time taught me something different. What began as dad revenge eventually became something deeper: accountability, redemption, and the rebuilding of a broken family story. Sometimes justice is necessary, but revenge alone cannot rebuild a family. Real strength is choosing what kind of ending your dad revenge becomes. If I could speak to my younger self, I would say this: don't wait decades to ask difficult questions. And don't assume the worst about the people you love. Pain can blind us just as much as greed can. In my darkest years, when I felt abandoned and humiliated, I now believe God was quietly guiding the path that would eventually bring the truth to light. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. If you found yourself in a situation like Brooks, facing betrayal and impossible choices, what would you have done? Your perspective matters to me, so feel free to share it in the comments. And if this story moved, you consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories. A gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real social themes, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling. If this type of content isn't for you, that's completely okay. There may be other videos here that better match your interests.